The digital lock on the guest room door glowed a solid, unblinking red. It was 5:00 a.m. I had woken up the way I had for the last 40 years, reaching across the mattress for my wife Eleanor, only to find the cold, high thread count sheets of a bed that wasn't mine. The disorientation usually faded after a few seconds, replaced by the familiar ache of her absence. But this morning, the disorientation was replaced by a sharp, mechanical click. I stood in the darkness of the glass-walled guest room, staring at the handle. I gripped the brushed steel and pulled. Nothing. I tried again, pushing my weight against the heavy composite wood. It didn't budge. There was no keyhole, no manual latch on the inside, just a sleek black glass panel that read, "Access Restricted." I was 68 years old, a retired lead urban planner for the city of Atlanta. I had spent my entire professional life designing pathways, egress routes, and public spaces meant to flow naturally. I understood how structures dictated human behavior, and right now, the architecture of my son's penthouse was telling me that I was not a resident. I was a contained variable. I sat on the edge of the bed, the red glow illuminating my hands. 2 weeks ago, I had a home. It was a 1920s craftsman in Decatur, complete with solid oak floors that groaned in the winter, a wraparound porch, and a garden Eleanor had spent decades cultivating. I knew every stress fracture in the foundation and every draft in the windows. It was paid off. It was mine. Then Jason and Sarah initiated their campaign. "Dad, it's too much house for one person," Jason had said, sitting at my battered kitchen table while Sarah took photos of my vintage tiles for her social media. "You're out here all alone. We're downtown. We want you close. We're building a multi-generational hub," Sarah had chimed in, her voice dripping with that manufactured empathy she used for her lifestyle vlogs. "We want to take care of you, Arthur. Sell this place. We'll pool our resources, get a massive penthouse downtown. You'll have your own wing. No more yard work, no more lonely mornings." I was tired. Grief has a way of making you question your own capacity to endure isolation. So, I signed the papers. I sold the craftsman for $450,000, a quick cash sale to an investor Jason recommended. I packed my life into 40 boxes, most of which were currently sitting in a climate-controlled storage unit because Sarah said my furniture didn't fit her curated minimalist aesthetic. At exactly 7:00 a.m., the red light on my door blinked twice and turned to soft green. The lock disengaged with a heavy thud. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the main living space. The penthouse was a $2.2 million monument to empty space. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline, a skyline I had spent decades helping to zone and regulate. The floors were polished concrete, the furniture was angular and unforgiving, and the air smelled heavily of whatever citrus basil diffuser Sarah was promoting that week. Jason was at the marble kitchen island, an espresso in one hand and his phone in the other. He was 34, dressed in a pristine black hoodie and expensive joggers, the uniform of a tech startup VP trying desperately to project casual wealth. "No, I told the manufacturer we need the retro soccer kits by Friday," Jason was barking into the phone. "The streetwear angle is the whole identity of FVB's store right now. Focus on the Manchester drop. The algorithm loves the athletic vintage crossover. Just get it done." He hung up, exhaling heavily, and finally noticed me. "Morning, Dad." "The door to my room was locked," I said, keeping my voice level. "From the outside." Jason waved a hand dismissively, not looking up from his tablet. "Oh yeah, it's a glitch in the smart home ecosystem. The network updates overnight, and sometimes the perimeter security protocol resets the interior doors. I'll have the IT guys look at it." A glitch. As an engineer of systems, I knew that glitches were random. A glitch doesn't lock at midnight and release precisely at 7:00 a.m. That was a schedule. Sarah walked into the kitchen, adjusting a heavy gold bracelet on her wrist. She didn't say good morning. Instead, she slid a sleek digital tablet across the marble counter toward me. "Arthur, I have the production crew coming at noon to shoot some sponsored content," she said, her eyes fixed on her own reflection in the dark oven glass. "I need the guest wing spotless, and the concierge downstairs is holding 3 boxes of fabric samples for me. Go grab them, unbox them in the utility room, and steam them. My assistant is out sick." I looked at the tablet. It wasn't a request, it was a shift schedule. "Sarah, I'm not your assistant," I said quietly. I turned to my son. "Jason, we need to talk about the bank. It's been 2 weeks since the Decatur house closed. I haven't seen the wire transfer for my portion of the equity, and I still don't have a physical key or a fob for the building. I can't even go for a walk without one of you buzzing me in." Jason sighed. The kind of exaggerated sigh a parent gives a toddler asking the same question for the 10th time. He set his espresso down and walked around the island, putting a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Dad, listen to yourself. You're stressing over logistics you don't need to worry about anymore," Jason said, his voice dropping into a patronizing register. "You're just dead weight in that old house. You are wasting away. Let us manage your life so you can just fade out comfortably. The money is in a joint holding account for the property taxes. We're handling it. Just relax and help Sarah out today." Fade out comfortably. The words hung in the sterile air. He didn't see me as a father or a partner in this living arrangement. He saw me as a depreciating asset that he had successfully liquidated. I was an unpaid intern who happened to fund his down payment. I didn't yell. I didn't throw the tablet. Anger is a spark, but precision is a blade. I simply nodded, picked up the tablet, and walked back to my room. I opened the one small duffel bag I'd been allowed to bring into the penthouse. From the bottom, beneath my socks, I pulled out a small, scuffed mahogany box. I opened the brass clasp. Inside lay my vintage drafting compass, heavy brass, perfectly calibrated, the tool I had used to sketch the blueprints of half the commercial districts in this city. It was the only piece of my professional identity I had brought with me. "Keep that rusty junk out of the living room, Arthur," Sarah called out from the hallway, having followed me to check if I was starting my chores. "It ruins the aesthetic. I don't want it scratching the concrete." She walked away before I could answer. I closed the box and set it carefully on the nightstand. I walked over to the nightstand on the opposite side of the bed and picked up the physical landline phone Jason had installed for emergencies. I picked up the receiver and dialed the direct office number for Martin Reed, my real estate attorney, and one of the few friends I had left from the old neighborhood. I waited for the ring. Instead, an automated female voice clicked onto the line. "We're sorry. Outgoing calls to non-approved numbers have been restricted by the account administrator. Goodbye." The line went dead. I slowly placed the receiver back onto the cradle. I looked back at the heavy door with its black glass panel. Jason was wrong. There was no glitch in the system. The system was working exactly as they had designed it. By early October, the temperature in Atlanta had begun to drop, carrying the first crisp edge of autumn. Inside the penthouse, however, the climate remained a rigid, digitally enforced 71 degrees. 3 weeks had passed since the sale of the Decatur house, 3 weeks of living in a velvet cage. I was standing in the center of the main living area, my arms trembling slightly as I held a massive silver reflector board above my head. The morning sun was pouring through the floor-to-ceiling glass, but it wasn't hitting the right angles for Sarah's lifestyle vlog. "Higher, Arthur," Sarah commanded, not looking up from the monitor of her camera rig. "I need the shadow on my left cheek to form a perfect triangle. It's called Rembrandt lighting. The Otis 85mm f1.4 lens catches absolutely every flaw in the depth of field. So if you let the bounce board dip, you ruin the 35mm film grain aesthetic I'm color grading for." "My shoulders are cramping, Sarah," I said, my voice quiet but strained. "Just 30 more seconds," she sighed, exasperated. "You don't have anywhere else to be." Across the room, Jason was pacing behind his marble island, barking into his headset. His e-commerce brand, FVB Store, had recently expanded onto TikTok, and he was obsessing over the metrics. "No, you have to optimize the product titles," Jason yelled, waving a hand in the air. "The algorithm is prioritizing the retro soccer kits this week. Push the Manchester United drops and rewrite the SEO tags for the Messi and Ronaldo jerseys. We need higher click-through rates. Make it sound like exclusive streetwear, not just athletic gear. If we don't hit our quarterly targets, the angel investors are going to pull the plug." I shifted my weight, trying to ease the burning in my rotator cuff. Jason's startup was burning through cash faster than it generated revenue. I could hear it in the frantic pitch of his calls. He was desperate to maintain the illusion of massive success, and this $2 million penthouse was the primary prop in that production. "Okay, cut," Sarah snapped, tapping her screen. "The light's gone anyway. Break down the C-stands, Arthur, and take the packaging from yesterday's PR boxes down to the service hallway. It's cluttering my workspace." She walked away without a thank you. Jason was already on another call, ignoring me completely. I carefully lowered the heavy reflector. As I walked to the kitchen to gather the heavy black trash bags, I opened the utility drawer to look for a zip tie. My breath caught. There, shoved between dead AA batteries, a broken wine opener, and a tangle of charging cables, was my vintage brass drafting compass. The mahogany box I had kept it in for 40 years was nowhere to be seen. Sarah hadn't just told me to put it away. She had tossed it in the junk drawer like loose change. I picked up the heavy brass instrument. The cold metal felt grounding against my palm. I wiped a smudge of grease off the hinge, folded it closed, and slipped it deep into my trouser pocket. A small, silent reclamation of my own history. I gathered the heavy bags of cardboard and walked to the rear of the penthouse. The service door was the only exit my restricted code would open. It led to a sterile concrete hallway where the freight elevator operated. When I pushed the heavy fire door open, I found a woman in a gray building staff uniform sitting on the concrete floor. She was surrounded by the disassembled pieces of a massive industrial carpet vacuum. She had a screwdriver in one hand and looked close to tears. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, scrambling to stand up. "I'm blocking the chute. I'll move." "Take your time," I said gently, setting the bags down. "It looks like you've got a structural failure on your hands." She wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist. "The brush roll is seized. If I can't get the hallway carpets finished by noon, the property manager is going to write me up again. It's just stuck." I knelt beside her. I spent my life studying how things bear weight and where friction causes systems to fail. "May I?" I asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "I'm Elena, by the way." "Arthur." I examined the heavy rotary brush. The bearing housing was completely choked with a densely packed ring of carpet fibers and thick thread. A screwdriver was too blunt to catch the edge. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my brass compass. I extended one of the sharp steel drafting points, wedged it carefully under the rubber seal of the bearing, and levered the compacted debris upward. It came out in one solid gray ring. I gave the brush a spin. It rotated freely, humming a smooth mechanical tune. I snapped the housing back together and stood up, offering her my hand. "You have to respect the mechanics," I smiled, "or the machine won't respect the operator." Elena looked at the vacuum, then up at me. Her expression shifted from relief to something much heavier. She looked back at the heavy steel door of Jason's penthouse. "Mr. Vance," she said softly, her voice dropping to a whisper, "why don't you ever use the main lobby elevators?" "My son tells me the smart locks are glitching," I replied carefully. "My key fob doesn't register on the main residential bank." Elena shook her head, looking pained. "It's not a glitch, Mr. Vance. Last week I was cleaning the management office. I heard your daughter-in-law on the phone with the concierge. She explicitly requested that your fob be deactivated for all exits except the service floor. The cold concrete of the hallway seemed to radiate up through my shoes. Did she give a reason?" Elena looked down at her work boots. "She told them you were suffering from early-stage dementia. She said you had a habit of wandering and getting confused, and it was a liability for the building." The final pillar of my paternal denial cracked and crumbled into dust. They hadn't just stolen my home. They were methodically building a paper trail to erase my autonomy. If Sarah was planning the narrative that I was cognitively impaired with the building staff, she was likely laying the groundwork to make it legally binding. "I see," I said, my voice shockingly steady. The retired father who wanted to keep the peace was gone. The urban planner, accustomed to surveying hostile terrain, took the wheel. "Thank you for telling me, Elena." I turned to go back inside, but Elena grabbed the sleeve of my sweater. She looked nervously up and down the empty concrete hallway. Then she walked over to her cleaning cart, unzipped the hidden laundry compartment in the back, and pulled out a thick stack of mail bound by a rubber band. She also told the mailroom to hold all your personal correspondence and forward it directly to her home office, Elena whispered, pressing the bundle into my hands. I know I can get fired for this. It's a federal offense to intercept mail. But I saw them tossing your letters into the shredder yesterday. I pulled these from the sorting desk before she came down this morning. Elena, you shouldn't risk your livelihood for me, I said, though my hands tightened around the envelopes. My father was a carpenter in El Paso, she said fiercely. He worked until his hands bled so my brother could go to college. When his mind started going, my brother put him in a state ward and sold his tools. I know what they're doing to you, Arthur. Hide those. She grabbed the vacuum handle and hurried down the hall before I could say another word. I stepped back into the penthouse, the service door locking heavily behind me with a sickening click. I walked into the utility room, turning my back to the hallway security camera Jason had installed. I snapped the rubber band off the mail. Most of it was junk, circulars, AARP magazines. But near the bottom was a crisp white envelope with the logo of a major national bank. It was addressed directly to me. I tore it open. It was a standard automated compliance letter. Dear Arthur Vance, this is a routine notification confirming the recent change to your guarantor status regarding the $1,750,000 mortgage on Unit 4201. Your primary liability has been successfully verified. I stared at the black ink. Unit 4201. The Penthouse. I hadn't just paid their down payment with the sale of the Decatur house. I was on the hook for a $2 million mortgage I had never seen for a property I wasn't legally allowed to leave. I folded the letter, slipped it into my pocket next to the brass compass, and looked down the hallway toward the heavy oak door of Sarah's locked home office. It was time to find out exactly what else my son had signed my name to. By the third week of October, the smart thermostat in the penthouse had been programmed to a permanent 68 degrees. I had learned to wear 2 sweaters. On a Friday morning, the sterile entryway was cluttered with 3 aluminum Rimowa suitcases. Jason and Sarah were preparing to leave for a 3-day e-commerce and streetwear summit in Miami. Jason was frantic, pacing the polished concrete while loudly firing an unpaid social media intern over his headset. Sarah was standing by the door, scrolling through her phone, completely ignoring her husband's escalating volume. She looked up only when I walked out of the kitchen. Arthur, the cleaning schedule is on the tablet, she said, not bothering to make eye contact. I want the guest wing baseboard scrubbed, and my home office needs a deep clean. Dust the shelves, but do not touch the filing cabinet under the desk. It's locked for client confidentiality. If my workspace is out of order when we get back Sunday night, we are going to have a serious problem. Have a safe flight, I said softly. Jason ended his call, grabbed the handles of 2 suitcases and looked at me. For a fraction of a second, I thought I saw a flicker of actual guilt cross his face, but then he adjusted his expensive jacket, erasing it entirely. Don't wait up, Dad. There's prepackaged meals in the fridge. Just stay out of trouble. He pulled his phone from his pocket, tapped the security application and walked out. The heavy front door slammed shut. A second later, the digital deadbolt engaged with a heavy motorized grind. I stood in the silence of the massive apartment. 20 minutes later, a soft, mechanical click echoed from the rear of the penthouse. The heavy fire door in the service hallway swung open. Elena stepped inside, pushing her gray plastic cleaning cart. She didn't speak. She looked at the hallway security camera Jason had installed, kept her back to it, and walked past me toward the utility room. I followed her, stepping into the camera's blind spot. Elena reached into the pocket of her smock. She pulled out a small, silver jagged key and pressed it into my palm. I was dusting her master vanity yesterday, Elena whispered. She keeps it in a carved wooden box beneath her makeup brushes. It's the physical override key for the electronic filing cabinet in her office. I looked at the cold metal in my hand. Elena, if they check the security logs... I paused the service corridor rotor for exactly 4 minutes to reset a faulty breaker. She interrupted, her voice steady. The cameras are looping. I have to go back to the 4th floor. You have the weekend, Arthur. Find out what they've done. She squeezed my arm, turned, and disappeared back into the service hallway. The door locked heavily behind her. I walked down the long, echoing corridor to Sarah's home office. It was a masterpiece of manufactured aesthetics. White oak desk, a wall of fake vintage fashion books, and a massive ring light angled perfectly toward a leather chair. Tucked neatly under the desk was a heavy, fireproof two-drawer filing cabinet. A red LED light blinked on its digital keypad. I knelt on the concrete floor. Beneath the keypad was a tiny rubber flap. I peeled it back, inserted the silver key Elena had risked her job to secure, and turned it. The locking bar disengaged with a heavy clack. I opened the bottom drawer. It wasn't filled with client files or design swatches. Sitting alone in the center of the drawer was a black steel lockbox secured by a 3-dial combination wheel. I pulled the box out and set it on the white oak desk. I didn't know the combination, but a lifetime of studying structural mechanics teaches you that every system has a physical tolerance, a margin of error. I reached into my pocket and took out my vintage brass drafting compass. I unfolded it, exposing the hardened steel needle used to anchor the tool into drafting paper. I slid the needle into the microscopic gap beside the first combination dial. I applied gentle upward pressure to the wheel and slowly rotated it. At the number 4, I felt the needle dip into the flat groove of the internal cam. I repeated the process. 4, 7, 2. I pulled the latch. The lockbox popped open. I sat in Sarah's designer leather chair and looked down at the paper trail of my own erasure. The first document was the HUD-1 settlement statement for the Penthouse. The purchase price was $2.2 million. The cash down payment was listed at exactly $450,000. I traced the numbers with my finger. That money wasn't just currency. It was the oak floors of my home in Decatur. It was the garden Eleanor had planted. It was 40 years of mortgage payments, weekend repairs, and quiet, honest living. Jason and Sarah had liquidated my history and poured the concrete directly into Sarah's name. The deed rested underneath the settlement statement, sole ownership, Sarah Vance. But $450,000 was only the down payment. I pulled out the thick stack of the mortgage agreement, $1,750,000. The primary borrower was an LLC controlled by Jason, but the LLC had zero assets. The bank required a human guarantor with an unblemished credit history and a guaranteed state-backed pension. I flipped to the signature page. There it was, Arthur Vance, signed in black ink on the line of the primary guarantor. I stared at my own name. It was a very good forgery. They had captured the looping curvature of the A and the sharp cross of the T. But they had missed the structural foundation. I had spent my entire adult life hand-lettering architectural blueprints. My baseline pressure was always perfectly horizontal, anchored to the drafting grid in my mind. This signature sloped downward by perhaps 3 degrees. Jason had signed it. My own son had forged my name to a federal financial document, tying me to nearly $2 million in debt for a cage I wasn't allowed to leave. I set the mortgage down. My chest felt hollow, but my hands were completely steady. Beneath the mortgage lay one final, thin manila folder. It was labeled AV, Medical/Legal. I opened it. Inside was a drafted medical power of attorney and a formal petition for involuntary conservatorship. I read the cold, clinical language. Arthur Vance, exhibiting signs of severe cognitive decline and spatial confusion. Tendency to wander, posing a physical liability. Recommendation for transfer to a secure, state-managed residential memory care facility to ensure his safety. I read the final page. It included a provision granting Sarah full administrative control over my city pension to cover the ongoing property taxes of his primary residence. They weren't just going to keep me as an unpaid servant. They were waiting for the ink on the mortgage to dry, and then they were going to have me declared legally incompetent. They would lock me in a state-run ward, drain my monthly pension to fund their lifestyle, and clear out the guest room. I sat perfectly still in the quiet office. For 2 years, since Eleanor died, I had operated on the belief that my son simply needed time. I had believed that my quiet generosity, my willingness to shrink my own footprint, would eventually bridge the gap between us. I had tried to be a good, supportive father. Looking at the conservatorship papers, that father died. I did not feel devastation. I did not feel the erratic heat of anger. I felt a profound, cold, structural clarity. The The retired urban planner who had zoned this very commercial district took his place. I was looking at an unauthorized demolition, and I knew exactly how to condemn the site. I reached into my pocket and pulled out an old, bulky 2008 Canon PowerShot digital camera I had smuggled in at the bottom of my duffel bag. I turned the flash off. Carefully, meticulously, I photographed every page of the HUD-1, forged mortgage, and the conservatorship petition. I checked the digital playback to ensure the macro focus captured the sloping baseline of the forged signature perfectly. When I was finished, I placed the documents back into the lockbox in the exact order I had found them. I closed the lid and scrambled the dials. I placed the box back in the bottom drawer of the cabinet. Then, I opened my brass compass. I placed the steel anchor against the inside wall of the drawer and extended the pencil lid to the edge of the lockbox. I measured the exact distance, 2.4 centimeters, and adjusted the box so it sat precisely where it had been when I opened the drawer. I closed the cabinet, turned Elena's silver key, and locked it. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window of the office and looked down at the sprawling Atlanta skyline. Jason and Sarah thought they owned this view. They thought they owned the airspace, the concrete, and my future. They had forgotten to check who owned the dirt they built it all on. The sub-basement of a commercial high-rise is its honest heart. While the penthouses are dressed in marble and glass to project an illusion of weightlessness, the basement is where the brutal reality of gravity, water, and pressure is managed. It is a landscape of raw concrete, exposed steel girders, and the heavy thrum of HVAC turbines. To me, it felt like home. It was Saturday morning. Elena had used her maintenance override key to take the service elevator past the lobby, dropping us 3 levels below the Atlanta streets. The air smelled of ozone and damp earth. She led me through a maze of utility corridors to the central boiler room, where the security cameras were blind. Waiting by a steel workbench was Martin Reed. Martin was 68, wearing a Saturday tweed jacket over a flannel shirt. We had known each other for 30 years. He had drawn up Eleanor's will, and we had played chess on my Decatur porch more times than I could count. When he saw me walking out of the shadows, looking thinner and wearing 2 sweaters against the penthouse chill, his jaw tightened. "Arthur," Martin said, putting a hand on my shoulder, "you look like a hostage." "I am, temporarily," I said. "Thank you for coming, Martin. And Elena, thank you for everything." Elena nodded, her eyes darting nervously toward the corridor. "I have to get back up to the 4th floor before my card is missed. I'll leave the service elevator on manual hold for 20 minutes. Be quick." She hurried away. I turned to Martin and set the old Canon digital camera on the workbench. "I need you to look at the photos on the SD card," I said. Martin opened his leather briefcase, pulled out a lightweight laptop, and inserted the card. He clicked through the first few images of the HUD-1 settlement statement. He frowned at the $450,000 cash down payment, but when he opened the photographs of the mortgage agreement, he stopped breathing. He zoomed in on the signature line. "A $1.75 million note," Martin said softly. He looked up at me. "Arthur, you didn't sign this." "No, notice the baseline. It slopes downward by about 3 degrees. Jason forged it." Martin clicked to the final photos, the drafted petition for involuntary conservatorship and the medical power of attorney, citing severe cognitive decline. He stared at the screen for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with disgust. "They used your home to buy the airspace. They used your spotless credit to finance the debt, and now they are preparing to declare you incompetent so they can seize your city pension to pay the property taxes," Martin summarized, snapping the laptop shut. "This isn't just elder abuse, Arthur. This is federal wire fraud. I'm calling the GBI right now. Jason will be in handcuffs before his flight from Miami lands." "No," I said quietly. Martin stared at me. "Arthur, he is planning to lock you in a state memory care ward. If we arrest him now, the bank will freeze everything, including my $450,000, in a criminal forfeiture proceeding that will take 5 years to resolve," I explained, leaning against the cold concrete wall. "Jason will hire a defense attorney who will claim I gave verbal consent and simply forgot due to my declining mental state. He will play the victim. I do not want a messy legal battle. I want a structural collapse." Martin narrowed his eyes. He knew that tone of voice. What are you proposing? In 1998, when I was the lead planner for the downtown revitalization project, the city needed the abandoned scrapyard I inherited from my father to anchor this commercial district, I said. I didn't sell the land, Martin. What did we do? Martin's eyes widened as the memory hit him. The Vance Land Trust. We executed a 99-year ground lease with the original developers. They own the building. You own the dirt it sits on. Exactly, I said. Pull up the master lease agreement, section 4. Martin hurriedly typed on his laptop, pulling up the archived files of my trust. He found the page and read it aloud. Clause 47, Covenant of Lawful Use. The lessee, including any sublessees or condominium deed holders, shall not use the premises for any unlawful purpose. In the event that felony financial fraud is committed on the premises by a leaseholder, the lessor retains the unilateral right to sever and void the specific leasehold without judicial eviction, initiating an immediate reversion of the unit to the land trust. Martin looked up, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. They own the airspace of the condo, I said, but the mortgage they forged is tied to the physical address. By committing federal bank fraud on the premises to acquire the unit, they violated the ground lease. The bank's collateral is sitting on my dirt. If I take this forgery directly to the bank's commercial compliance division, they will realize their $1.75 million note is completely unsecured, Martin realized, his voice rising with excitement. The bank will instantly freeze their assets, and because you are voiding the ground lease for their specific unit, Sarah's deed becomes a worthless piece of paper. You seize the penthouse. Submit the photographs to the bank's compliance officers on Monday morning, I instructed. Do not contact the local branch. Go straight to the corporate fraud division in Charlotte. Tell them the landowner is initiating the reversion clause. It will be my absolute pleasure, Martin said, packing his briefcase. I took the service elevator back up to my velvet cage. 3 days later, on Wednesday afternoon, the penthouse was a hurricane of superficial chaos. Jason and Sarah had returned from Miami, their egos inflated by a weekend of networking. Tonight was their massive housewarming party. Atlanta's e-commerce investors, local fashion influencers, and startup executives were scheduled to arrive at 7 o'clock. Caterers were setting up a raw bar on the marble kitchen island. A DJ was testing acoustic levels in the corner. Sarah was aggressively directing a florist, demanding that the white orchids not obstruct the view of the skyline. I was standing quietly in the hallway, holding a glass of water. Sarah noticed me and sighed, walking over with a clipboard pressed to her chest. She was wearing a designer silk dress that likely cost more than my first car. Arthur, the guests are arriving in 2 hours, she said, her voice tight with stress. I've had the caterers put a plate of food in your room. I need you to stay in the guest wing tonight. Keep the door closed. We have angel investors coming, and the whole confused elderly relative aesthetic really kills the vibe of a high-end streetwear brand launch. Jason walked up behind her, adjusting his tailored jacket. He patted my shoulder with that same patronizing, heavy hand. It's just for tonight, Dad, Jason said smoothly. Besides, we need to sit down next week and have a serious talk about your future. We've been looking into some specialized care facilities, places with around-the-clock nursing. It's getting to be too much for you here. He was smiling. He was looking at his father, planning to steal my freedom and my pension, and he was smiling. I understand, I said perfectly calmly. I will be in my room. I walked into the guest wing and closed the heavy door. I sat on the edge of the bed. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a cheap plastic prepaid burner phone Elena had smuggled to me that morning. At exactly 6:45 p.m., the screen illuminated with a single text message from Martin. Bank compliance has reviewed the covenant and verified the forgery. The mortgage is frozen. Ground lease reversion is active. Demolition approved. I put the phone in my pocket. I opened my small duffel bag and pulled out a rolled-up architectural schematic of the building I had taken from the management office. I spread it flat on the bed. I took out my vintage brass drafting compass. I placed the sharp steel point precisely in the center of Unit 4201. I extended the pencil lid to the exterior walls, applied pressure, and drew a perfect, heavy, unbroken circle around the penthouse. I folded the compass, slipped it into my jacket pocket, and stood up. The red light on my door lock was glowing, but Jason had forgotten that the schedule didn't lock the door until midnight. I pushed the handle down, opened the door, and walked out to join the party. The bass from the DJ booth vibrated against the polished concrete floors of the penthouse. The main living space was packed with over 60 people, a curated blend of Atlanta's tech startup investors, local fashion influencers, and Jason's e-commerce partners. I stood at the edge of the hallway, watching the machinery of my son's ambition operate. Sarah was holding court near the Marble Island, surrounded by a group of women holding champagne flutes. She gestured expansively toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. "We completely self-funded," she was saying, her voice carrying over the music. "Jason's startup is scaling beautifully, and we wanted a space that reflected our brand's aesthetic, pure independence. We bought the unit entirely in my name." On the other side of the room, Jason was leaning in close to two older men in expensive tailored suits, angel investors he desperately needed to hit his quarterly targets. He was showing them mock-ups of the new vintage soccer kits on his tablet. I adjusted my jacket, feeling the weight of the brass compass in my pocket, and walked out of the shadows into the center of the room. Jason saw me first. His pitch faltered. The easy, charismatic smile he wore for the investors tightened into a mask of pure panic. He quickly handed the tablet to one of the men and hurried across the room to intercept me. "Dad!" Jason hissed, grabbing my elbow. His grip was entirely too hard. "What are you doing? I told you to stay in the guest wing. You're confused again. Let's get you back to bed." He tried to steer me backward, performing the role of the burdened, loving son perfectly. I did not move. I simply looked down at his hand on my arm until he realized I was not going to be physically corralled. "I am exactly where I need to be, Jason," I said, my voice calm, projecting just enough to carry over the nearby conversations. Sarah noticed the commotion and pushed her way through the crowd, her face flushed with anger. "Arthur, you are ruining the aesthetic of this launch. I'm calling the concierge." Before she could reach for her phone, the private elevator at the rear of the penthouse dinged. The heavy steel doors slid open. Martin Reed stepped out. He was flanked by two uniformed private security contractors he had hired for the evening. Martin wasn't wearing his Saturday tweed. He was wearing a charcoal litigation suit, carrying a thick red legal folder. He looked exactly like what he was, a highly expensive attorney delivering an eviction. The room grew quiet as the music was abruptly turned down by the DJ, who sensed the sudden shift in atmospheric pressure. "Who the hell are you?" Jason demanded, stepping in front of Sarah. "This is a private residence." "Actually, it isn't," Martin said, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. He stopped 3 feet from Jason and handed him the red folder. "My name is Martin Reed. I represent the Vance Land Trust. You are currently trespassing." Jason laughed, a nervous, breathless sound. He looked at his investors, who were now watching the exchange with intense, unblinking focus. "Trespassing? My wife owns the deed to this penthouse. We just closed on it for $2.2 million. "You did," I said. I stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Martin. I looked at the investors, then back to my son. "You convinced me to sell the home I built with your mother. You took the $450,000 in cash and used it as the down payment. Then, because your e-commerce startup has zero liquid assets, you needed a guarantor for the $1.75 million mortgage." "Dad, stop it," Jason whispered, his eyes wide, pleading now. "You're having an episode. Stop talking." "I am perfectly lucid," I said. I reached into the red folder Jason was holding and pulled out a blown-up, high-resolution photograph of the mortgage signature page. I held it up. "This is the mortgage note filed with the federal bank," I said, my voice steady, analytical, and cold. "It lists me as the primary guarantor. It bears my signature. But as I spent my entire career hand-lettering architectural blueprints, my signature is perfectly horizontal. This forgery, executed by my son, slopes downward by exactly 3 degrees. The bank's corporate fraud division verified the discrepancy this morning." A collective murmur rippled through the room. The two angel investors Jason had been pitching slowly set their drinks down on the marble counter. Sarah's face drained of color. "Jason," she breathed, looking at her husband, "what is he talking about?" "It's a lie," Jason stammered, his hands shaking as he held the folder. He's demented. He signed it and forgot. We have medical power of attorney papers drafted. Papers you drafted to lock me in a state memory care facility so you could steal my city pension to pay your property taxes. I finished for him. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The silence in the room was absolute. But you made a structural error, Jason. You built a $2 million lie without checking the foundation. I turned to Sarah. You own the airspace of this condominium, Sarah, I said. But you do not own the ground it sits on. I nodded to Martin. Martin pulled a copy of a 1998 commercial document from his briefcase. In 1998, Arthur Vance zoned and planned this commercial district, Martin announced to the silent room. He also executed a 99-year ground lease with the developers. The Vance Land Trust owns the dirt beneath this high-rise, and under Clause 47, the Covenant of Lawful Use, if a leaseholder commits felony financial fraud on the premises, the landowner retains the unilateral right to void their specific leasehold. I looked at my son. The arrogance had entirely collapsed, leaving behind a terrified boy who finally realized he was out of his depth. The bank froze the fraudulent mortgage at 4 o'clock this afternoon, I told him. And because I have formally voided your ground lease, your condominium deed is legally worthless. The asset has reverted to the trust to cover the theft of my equity. You can't, Jason choked out, tears of genuine panic welling in his eyes. We'll lose everything. The investors... Angel investors tolerate financial risk, I interrupted quietly. They do not tolerate federal wire fraud. Right on cue, the two older men in tailored suits picked up their coats from the entryway. They didn't look at Jason. They walked straight out the front door. Within 60 seconds, the influencers, the partners, and the caterers followed suit. Nobody wanted to be in the room when the implosion reached the foundation. You have 30 days to vacate the premises before the sheriffs arrive to physically remove you, Martin said, checking his watch. The bank's corporate attorneys will be in touch regarding the forged $1.75 million note. I suggest you retain federal criminal defense counsel. Sarah dropped her champagne flute. It shattered against the polished concrete, a sharp, violent sound in the empty penthouse. She turned to Jason, her influencer facade completely gone, her eyes blazing with fury. You forged the mortgage? You told me it was a bridge loan. Jason sank onto one of the expensive modular sofas, burying his face in his hands. I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired, but lighter than I had in months. The cage was broken. I turned around and walked out the front door, leaving them in the ruins of their own design. 1 week later, the temperature in Atlanta finally dropped below freezing. I stood in the lobby of the building, my duffel bag over my shoulder. Upstairs, Jason and Sarah were furiously packing boxes, arguing loud enough to be heard in the hallway. The bank had initiated civil action, and Jason was facing multiple counts of wire fraud. My $450,000 was fully secured by the value of the seized penthouse, which Martin was already quietly putting on the market. I walked over to the concierge desk. Elena was polishing the brass fixtures near the mailroom. When she saw me, she wiped her hands on her apron and smiled. I reached into my jacket and handed her a thick, sealed envelope. "What is this?" she asked, hesitating. "It's a cashier's check," I said gently. "Enough to pay off your brother's claim on your father's estate, and enough to send you to night classes for that property management license you told me about." Elena looked at the envelope, tears instantly spilling over her eyelashes. "Arthur, I can't take this. I only helped you because it was the right thing to do." "I know," I said. "That's precisely why you deserve it. A good foundation should be rewarded." I gave her hand a squeeze, turned and walked out the heavy glass doors into the bright, cold Atlanta morning. I stopped on the sidewalk and reached into my pocket. I pulled out my vintage brass drafting compass. I ran my thumb over the cold, worn metal, feeling the exactness of its calibration. I slipped it back into my pocket and began the walk toward Martin's office, ready to draw up the plans for whatever came next. Have you ever had to draw a hard boundary with family after they mistook your generosity for weakness? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories.